In 1802, we got this great Thomas Jefferson quote. "It may be the pleasure and pride of an American to ask what farmer, what mechanic, what laborer ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States." And he was right. Taxes were very, very low. There was no income tax, there was no window tax, there wasn't the plethora of petty taxes that was going on that had led to the French Revolution. Each state was a sovereign entity and they taxed their people locally, but small, and there was no nationwide tax system. In 1812, America and Britain went to war again, known as the War of 1812. It actually went on for 3 years, this war. And at this point, except for in this war, the federal government collected no revenue. What a thought. Not a penny. No revenue. Then this war went along, the War of 1812, and eventually the English gave it up because we had stuff to do with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. We'd blocked trade to the US. And so America had found itself really short of essential equipment in this war because it relied on imports. They were strategically short. And then, because of the trade blockades, a sort of build-up of goods had happened. So as soon as the war ended, British merchants flooded America with British goods. And North American industry was in trouble in the northern states. And so this tariff was proposed in 1816, this new tariff with high import duties to protect and nurture northern industry. And this is exactly what Trump is doing now. He wants to introduce tariffs to protect and grow American industry for strategic reasons. Sensible. But the tariff hit the South hardest because the southern states, were the main importer of goods from abroad. Southerners found themselves effectively paying 75% of federal taxes. 75%.
Wow.
But they weren't getting anything for their money because if they were buying imported goods, the money was being spent in the north. Nails, Iron was the most heavily taxed item, but so iron, steel, nails were taxed at over 100%. And international trade, immediately it fell off because the taxes were too high, it always does. Imports halved, and Moses Leonard of New York called it one of the grossest acts of injustice ever perpetrated by an American Congress upon a free and intelligent people.
Welcome back to another episode of Cypherpunk'd. I'm here with Dominic Frisby, and we are going to start the next episode of our series on his book, Daylight Robbery. And this is perhaps one of the most interesting episodes because it talks about the Civil War and provides insight on things about the Civil War that you're not taught here in the public education system in America. So with that being said, welcome, Dominic.
Well, thank you very much. And when I wrote this book, I had no idea that this chapter was going to be so big. And it was just one of those things. I started reading about it. And at one point in an early edit of the book, this chapter was about half the book.
Fascinating.
And
it's so relevant to what's happening
it
today.
really is relevant.
This is just coincidence because, we plan this trip, months in advance. And you just so happen to be here at a time when some of these tax ideas and the concept of tariffs are so central to everything happening in the world right now. So not a better time to record this.
Yeah. And I've said it before, but I just somehow pray that a copy of this book falls into either Donald Trump or Elon Musk's hands, this chapter in particular, because, tariffs, I support what he's doing, but beware tariffs because they can have grave, grave consequences, particularly if they go on too long. And that is the danger with new taxes. You impose them and they work for a bit and then they go on too long and they're not repealed. And so unless, I'd like to see him impose these taxes, but as part of the statute, they expire after such and such a time. But he's also using these taxes. They're a flex. They're going, you don't want to take the illegal immigrants? We're giving you 50% tariffs. You don't want to, repeal your taxes on our goods, you're getting 25%. So they're a flex at the moment, although steel and aluminium seem to be coming. But it also
why do you think, again, this is not related to the book, but it is in the sense of tariffs, but why do you think he's putting a 25% tariff which was announced recently, on those specific goods?
For exactly the same reason that Americans did in 1816. And so
National security, essentially.
National security.
Which does make sense because the government, that's, in my opinion, one of the few roles of the government is to provide for the common defense and the national security of the nation.
Yes. Right. And we're going to come to this in a second. I'm just going to frame the whole argument.
Okay.
And the argument of this chapter about the American Civil War is that it arose from injudicious taxation, much more than it did over an argument over the legal status of slaves, which is what you're taught.
We're taught that in American school. I mean, that's like gospel. That is like gospel. It's like, hey, Abraham Lincoln wanted to free the slaves, and that's the kind of the
it is gospel
story they paint you.
And I think that is the victor rewriting history, as Churchill.
No doubt.
Churchill puts it.
No doubt about it.
This is from the address of the people of South Carolina to before the Civil War began. The people of the southern states are not only taxed for the benefit of the northern states, but after the taxes are collected, 3/4 of them are expended in the north. This has made the cities of the south provincial. Their growth is paralyzed. They are mere suburbs of the northern cities.
Fascinating.
That is why the southern states wanted to secede. But the story of tariffs in North America goes all the way back to the turn of the 19th century. And at this, broadly speaking, there were three main sections to America. You had the North, which was moving from trading and shipping towards industrial production. You had the South, the mighty wealth of the South, built on agriculture, producing tobacco, sugar, 2/3 of the world's cotton. Obviously, slaves in the fields, a huge part in that. And then you had out west, the Louisiana Purchase, this real estate deal that we just talked about, $15 million for 800,000 square miles of land, all the way from New Orleans right up the Mississippi. Worst real estate deal in history if you're French. Best real estate deal in history if you're American. And so the West was expanding into those regions. California out that, not part of the United States yet.
Can you also explain the unfairness? So I guess the 3/4 of all the taxes spent on the United States, right? 3/4 of that went and was spent in the northern states. Why?
We're going to come to that.
Okay.
I was just framing the whole argument with that quote.
Okay.
So slavery had been illegal in the North since 1804. In theory, not in practice. And in 1802, we got this great Thomas Jefferson quote. It may be the pleasure and pride of an American to ask what farmer, what mechanic, what laborer ever sees a tax gatherer of the United States. And he was right. Taxes were very, very low. There was no income tax. There was no window tax. There wasn't the plethora of petty taxes that was going on that had led to the French Revolution, to, that were going on in Britain with William Pitt and so on. Each state was a sovereign entity, and they taxed their people locally, but small, and there was no nationwide tax system. And in 1812, America and Britain went to war again, known as the War of 1812. It actually went on for 3 years, this war. And at this point, except for in this war, the federal government collected no revenue. What a thought. Not a penny. No revenue. Then this war went along, the War of 1812, and eventually the English gave it up because we had stuff to do with the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And there was all sorts of we'd blocked trade to the US. And so America had found itself really short of essential equipment in this war because it relied on imports. They were strategically short. And then, because of the trade blockades, a sort of build-up of goods had happened. So as soon as the war ended, British merchants flooded America with British goods. And North American industry was in trouble in the northern states. And so this tariff was proposed in 1816, this new tariff with high import duties to protect and nurture northern industry. industry in the northern states. And this is exactly what Trump is doing now. He wants to introduce tariffs to protect and grow American industry for strategic reasons. Sensible. But the tariff hit the South hardest because the South, the southern states, were the main importer of goods from abroad. They would buy British equipment, and in exchange, they would sell the British cotton, tobacco, sugar, but especially cotton. But the South agreed. Not only did they agree to the tariff, they agitated for it because of this issue of security.
They put the national interest first.
They put the national interest first. But it was only going to be a temporary tariff. This was the thing. It was only going to be for 4 years.
Cotton prices were good.
Cotton prices were good. They had money.
They weren't greedy. You know,
they were. We're all greedy.
Everyone's a little greedy, but you know, they were willing to share the prosperity of America. They understood the bigger picture, right? Everybody was bought in, right?
Absolutely.
And it was supposed to be for 3 years, I think, right? 3 years on this one.
I thought 4, but maybe it was 3. In any case, how often does a subsidy, a temporary tax, become permanent? And the expiry date came in 1820. And of course, the northern manufacturers who'd benefited from it, they wanted more. And there was a new bill for a tariff with higher duties was put forward, and it passed the House and it failed in the Senate by 1 vote. Because this time, of course, it didn't have the support of the South.
Yeah, the South said no.
And the reasons for the previous support of the previous tariff had gone.
Yeah.
And what's more, the price of cotton had fallen in 1819, so they weren't feeling quite as well off. And the debts of the War of 1812 had been paid down. The trade wars had all but vanished. It was no longer a national emergency. But the desire for protectionist tariffs remained strong in the northern states. And in 1824, they proposed another tariff, and this one did pass. And the tax on imported goods was 33%.
Wow.
33%. And then, 1828, came another tariff. This was known as the Tariff of Abominations. And it saw 92% of imported goods taxed at 38%. And the northern and western states allied to get it passed. And Southerners found themselves effectively paying 75% of federal taxes. 75%.
Wow.
But they weren't getting anything from their money, because if they were buying imported goods, the money was being spent in the north. So they were paying this money and not getting anything from their money. And the other choice they had was, instead of importing goods, was to buy northern goods instead, but they were more expensive and they weren't as good.
And the money was still going to the north.
And the money was still going to the north. And so the Southerners had this grievance they were being legislated against. And the cotton prices had fallen by another 50% at this point. And already, so we're now in 1828, already South Carolina is making noises about secession. And they had some support from Kentucky and North Carolina, Virginia. Then they had some, by 1832, Alabama, Georgia, and Maryland had joined them. And they had a convention, and the tariffs were declared unconstitutional and therefore unenforceable. And we went into this thing called the nullification crisis. And your president was Jackson. He said he was going to collect duties by force, and the country was close to civil war at this point. And then a legislative from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, he'd been vice president at one stage. He agreed a compromise with Henry Clay, who was one of the main proponents of the tariff, and they agreed this deal where import taxes would fall by 10% every 2 years until they reached 20% by 1842. And for almost a decade, tariffs disappeared as an issue. And
basically avoided war.
They avoided war, and the tariffs came down and down and down. But again, 1842 comes along, and those northern states, they want the tariffs. And Henry Clay was their champion, and they revived the argument that they were vulnerable to British competition. And in 1842, they got this thing called the Black Tariff passed. And it passed in the House and the Senate, again, by one vote.
Yeah.
It was marginal.
Wonder what the payoff was.
And the South had been waiting for tariffs all this time for tariffs to come back to 20%.
That was the agreement, right?
And instead they rose
unbelievable.
back to the level of the tariffs of abominations. And the South was furious about it. Revolution would be the effect, one Robert Redd said. And they called themselves slaves to the North, a chap from Alabama, William Payne, said. And it would, nails... Iron was the most heavily taxed item, but so iron, steel, nails were taxed at over 100%. And international trade, immediately it fell off because the taxes were too high. It always does. Imports halved. And Moses Leonard of New York called it one of the grossest acts of injustice ever perpetrated by an American Congress upon a free and intelligent people. But again, crisis was avoided. Polk defeated Henry Clay in the presidential race, and he declared that reducing the tariff would be one of his 4 measures of his administration. And he got his Treasury Secretary Robert Walker, to go to work. Walker did that, and he proposed reducing tariffs and standardizing them.
I think they went down to 25%.
Yes.
And then this is a common lesson throughout the book. You know, when the rates go down, the revenue goes up. Isn't that
absolutely? And the Northwesterners who agreed with them, and the tariff passed 1846. And he was right, because despite the low rates, customs revenue actually increased by 50%. 50%. It's a lot.
Wow.
In 4 years. But now, in 1850, and this was the issue, slavery at this point, South Carolina threatened secession for a second time in 1850. And it was over the issue of slaves in the new states after the Mexican-American War. So this was the status of slaves in California, New Mexico, all those states there. And they were worried that if slavery was illegal in these new states, they would have fewer allies in the nation's capital. And slavery was essential to their business because, you know, they worked in the fields and so on. And
but it wasn't such a big issue that they voted to succeed.
No,
it failed.
They didn't. They had a vote over it, over the issue of slavery, and the vote was absolutely slaughtered. The non-secessionists got 59% of the vote.
Yeah.
They got just 41%.
Majority of people were against succeeding.
They were against it.
Even
when the issue was slavery.
Yeah. Okay.
When the issue was something else.
So it was definitely an issue, but
yeah,
not,
it was an issue, but not enough to get over the line and go to war over. So they had a vote. Do we secede over the issue of slavery? No. 1850, very clear.
And this was just South Carolina.
This was South Carolina.
Which was the most agitated state about
exactly.
Tariffs. Okay.
Exactly. And then over the course of the 1850s, the economy was doing well, and the tariffs saw rates reduced even further until we got to 1857, where they were back to 15%, which is where they were when that first tariff passed in 1816. So it took 40 years to get back to the rates of that first tariff.
Wow.
With a bit of up and down on the way. And then we got this financial panic, the Panic of 1857. And what had happened there is that Crimean War had been going on in Europe. And so America had been exporting lots of grain to Europe because there was no production coming from Ukraine and Russia, the breadbasket of Europe. But then suddenly European farming resumed, harvests were good, and American imports declined. And I think English purchase of American wheat fell by 90%, something like that.
Yikes.
And so there was just a financial panic. Loads of companies went bust. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. The railroad sector was hit because it had had the boom of all the investment when the railroads were built, and that particular railroad bubble popped as well. There was a ship, the SS Central America. By the way, this is very interesting extra thing to this book. I'll come to it in a moment. Just remind me to talk about the gold rush and where the gold from the gold rush went. This ship was carrying gold from California.
The one that sunk.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it had something like 30,000 pounds of gold on it.
Wow.
And it sunk. And that shook public.
That's what they tell everybody.
Well, no, they found it. I think several years later, I think Deep Sea Divers got it later on. But in all this panic, and loads of people lost their jobs, the South wasn't hit that hard because it wasn't exposed to all these businesses. The railroads didn't matter. The insurance companies that went bust didn't matter. The banking and so on didn't matter. If anything, it restored Southern belief in themselves because they were just exporting their cotton and tobacco and sugar to Europe.
But it did fall off. I mean, they weren't.
It fell off, but they just weren't hit like the rest of America.
Okay, gotcha.
And so, but anyway, the panic led to new legislation, and this chap Henry Carey came along, and he was an economist, and he blamed the financial crisis on the low tariff of 1857. And his ideas got a lot of traction. And this chap came along, Justin Smith Morrill, from the Republic Party, and he designed a new tariff, the Morrill Tariff, which was going to take them back to 1846 levels, which was bad. In fact, in reality, the rates were even higher. And it was eventually passed in 1860, this Morrill Tariff.
There's so many parallels to today with just like anytime there's a crisis or a panic, and just instead of letting it work itself out, the government just feels like it has to do something. It just kind of reminds me of COVID. It's like, instead of letting people just make their own decisions, stay home, go to work, do your own thing, mask up, wear a mask, get a vaccine, don't get a vaccine. Let people make their own decisions. They got to gaslight, manipulate, force people, use force, pass this crazy stimulus that gave everybody printing trillions of dollars out of thin air and just throwing it in the market and not expecting inflation. And now everyone's wondering, why we're having 70-year high levels of inflation, and the cost of rents and housing and everything is up so high that people can't afford anything. It kind of echoes that same sentiment. These things in history, it doesn't always repeat, but it rhymes, right? So it's a very similar concept.
Absolutely. And when people are panicking, somebody's got to do something, and that's when government comes in with its legislation and its taxation. But in any case, this Morrill Tariff had one key big supporter, and his name was Abraham Lincoln. I am in favor of the internal improvement system and a high protective tariff. These are my sentiments and political principles. This was his first political announcement. He said that. And those principles remain. My views have undergone no material change on the subject, he said 30 years later in 1860. The tariff is to the government what a meal is to the family. That was Lincoln.
Wow.
And when there were these famous competition to become the Republican nominee, and it was William Seward against Abraham Lincoln. And Seward was an enemy of slavery. And he went to town. He was going, there's a higher law in the Constitution, in the debates. And he was terribly, terribly anti-slavery. Lincoln avoided the issue. Wily, solicitor politician. If he didn't have to speak out on it, he didn't. And he might have abhorred slavery privately. I'm sure he did. But his strategy, his own words, was to bite my lip and keep quiet.
He wasn't going to alienate voters over
No.
it.
And it was his vocal support of protectionist tariffs that won him the nomination. Particularly he won the key seats. Pennsylvania was one of the key swing ones he had to win.
Sounds familiar.
And then, indeed.
Sounds very familiar.
And
Pennsylvania being that key swing state.
Yeah.
Some things never change.
Well, I think it will always be. And it wants tariffs. So Lincoln's main rival when the election came was the Democrat, Stephen Douglas. But the Democrats were divided. The Northerners were voting for Douglas and the Southerners were voting for this guy, Breckinridge. And so Lincoln only needed to make sure 40%. He beat Douglas.
He got 40% of the vote.
He got 40%.
He won, became president with 40%.
40% of the vote.
It's kind of strange.
It's terrible.
Think about that today.
It's like similar to the Labour government in the UK. Where I think they got like 30. 80% of British people did not vote Labour. But I think they won, of people who actually voted, they won 35 or 40%. But they won this incredible majority, 63% of seats. It's just the system is so skewed. Anyway. And when he at the one of the speeches, the thing that got the biggest cheer was the tariff plank in Pennsylvania. Apparently, Pennsylvania went into spasms of joy, everyone throwing their hats in the air and all the rest of it. And so President Lincoln got the gig, president of the US, 40% of the vote, not one seat in the South, everything in the North and West. In all the states he succeeded, he did not win anything. Okay? And the Morrill Tariff was the 12th of the 17 planks in the Republican platform. And immediately, one by one, the southern states began withdrawing. And let me just see if I can find that very famous Lincoln quote.
No right or purpose to interfere with slavery.
Yes.
Is what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no right or purpose to interfere with slavery. He said that, and they still seceded. And they felt they were doing exactly as their ancestors had done to the British. They had no representation in this government, and they didn't see why they should pay taxation if they had no representation. And by the 1st of February, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas had followed South Carolina out of the Union. And these 7 states formed the Confederacy.
So I think it's important to note on the back of that quote, he also offered as a compromise, Abraham Lincoln said, he offered this amendment to not interfere with slavery.
Yeah.
And the South still said no.
Yeah.
The tariffs were the bigger issue, and Lincoln would not compromise on that. So even though he said, look, we're going to put an amendment, we're not going to ban slavery, they still said, we're still succeeding, and it's nothing to do with slavery. Essentially, by doing that, they're saying it doesn't have to do with slavery. That's not the main issue. The main issue is tariffs.
Yeah. So Carey, the economist who was advising Lincoln, he said the whole success of your administration depends on getting this moral tariff through over the wire.
Wow.
And of course, the opponents, the seceded states, couldn't vote against it, so the bill passed Congress easily.
Was this the same advisor that was trying to get him not to interfere, basically to get him to withdraw from Fort Sumter? Is that a different advisor?
No, that was a Colonel Baldwin.
Okay, Colonel Baldwin.
Colonel Baldwin. People
don't
don't know about that. It's amazing,
it's
but
wild.
there's all these
different advisors.
transcript. Yeah,
Makes sense, yeah. And the South wanted just a peaceful succession. They didn't want to have war. They
didn't want it. They were tricked into war.
Yeah.
But here's that Lincoln quote: "I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so." And as you say, Congress offered them constitutional rights, and there'd been a court ruling to do with some slave who bought his freedom or something. So it had
Dred Scott, maybe.
Yeah, Judge Dred Scott. That's it.
Dred Scott decision.
So you had the court, Congress, and the president all saying, "We're not going to interfere with your slavery. It's fine. Don't worry about it." And they still wanted to secede. And the thing is, Lincoln would not compromise on tariffs and revenue because the revenue they generated was too valuable. He always talked about the Union, the importance of the Union. Well, it was Union revenue.
Yeah.
So, and he said, "The power confided to me will be used to hold, occupy, and possess the property and places belonging to the government and to collect the duties and imposts. Beyond what may be necessary for these objects, there will be no invasion, no using of force against or among the people anywhere." So he would use force to collect taxes, but for no other purpose.
It's fascinating that, they couldn't come to this compromise because it seemed like the South was willing to put up with a little bit. They were willing to do 20%, the collections were good. So to me, it's kind of just wild that they just they just had to get greedier and greedier and greedier and greedier.
Yeah. It was protectionist greed.
Yeah.
And it was, it's the same tax, just the extent of it, degree of it. And meanwhile, the Republicans, the Confederacy draft their own constitution, which was almost identical to the US Constitution. Mm-hmm. But the most telling difference was the sovereignty granted to each state and the limitations on federal power to collect taxes. Those were the two main differences. And I won't go into detail about what was in the Southern Constitution. We'll carry on telling the story.
But Jefferson Davis, let's talk about him a little bit. He tried to meet with Lincoln early on, have a delegation, and Lincoln just said, "No, I'm not meeting with you."
The South did there were some things in the Constitution about slavery, because they don't use the word slavery in the Constitution. They use another word, but everything was left to the individual state to decide what it wanted to do. Mm-hmm. This was the point. The South didn't want a war. It couldn't, it was smaller than the North. It couldn't defeat the North. They had fewer people. And, they were agricultural people, and their main interest was exporting commodities. And our true policy, Jefferson Davis, is peace and the freest trade which necessities will permit. There should be the fewest practicable restrictions upon the interchange of commodities. In other words, the fewest taxes. And the first thing he did as president of the Confederacy was write to Lincoln. He sent a peace delegation to Washington. Lincoln would not talk to them. He wouldn't meet with them. He wouldn't converse with them. So you've got Fort Sumter. This fort in Charleston Harbor controlled access to the harbor, and it was one of the many points along America's coast where taxes were collected. And it was occupied by Union troops. But the Confederacy at this point has seceded. And so the Confederacy are trying for weeks to get them to go, and they won't go. It's offered to pay them compensation for Fort Sumter, and not just for Fort Sumter, but for all federal property. And Seward, who was Lincoln's number 2 now, had promised the Confederacy that the forts would be evacuated, but the guy at Fort Sumter refused to go. We're in April now. Not a single bullet has been fired. And there's this Unionist colonel called John Baldwin, and there's a fantastic transcript which you can find on the internet. And he'd been called to Lincoln to update him on events in the secession convention in Virginia, which has not seceded at this point. We have a clear and controlling majority of 3-1. In other words, they're not going to secede. We're going to win with perfect certainty. Withdraw the troops at Sumter, he begged the president, for the sake of peace. If you take that position, there is national feeling enough in the seceded states themselves and all over the country to rally to your support, and you would gather more friends than any man in the country has ever had. For every one of your friends whom you would lose by such a policy, you would gain 10 who would rally to you and to the national standard of peace and union. This is what the colonel was telling.
That's fascinating.
Lincoln. Sumter was a tariff collection point. You know what Lincoln's answer was? What about the revenue? How about that? What about the revenue? What would I do about the collection of duties? That was what he was thinking about. Not about friends, preserving the union. What about the revenue?
Show me the money.
That's what he was thinking about. How much do you expect to collect in a year? Baldwin asked him. 50 or 60 millions, Lincoln replied. Why, sir? Say 250 million would be the revenue of your term of the presidency. What is that but a drop in the bucket compared with the cost of such a war as we are threatened with? Let it all go if necessary. But I do not believe it will be necessary because I believe you can settle it. If there is a gun fired at Sumter, I don't care on which side it is fired, the thing is gone. And as sure as there is a God in heaven, the thing is gone. Virginia herself, strong as the Union majority in the convention is now, will be out in 48 hours.
It's crazy how prescient he was.
Yeah.
He just hit the nail on the head.
It goes, you have a choice to make, and you have to make it very soon. You have, I believe, the power to place yourself up by the side of Washington himself as the savior of your country, or by taking a different course of policy to send down your name on the page of history notorious forever. Well, he chose war.
The 12th of April.
And Baldwin was right, because when the first shells were fired at Sumter 1 week later, none of Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee had succeeded. But as soon as those shots were fired, they all wanted to remain in the Union, and they wanted the Union to remain.
Mm-hmm.
But when it became clear that Lincoln was going to use force against the Confederacy, they had new votes, and they all voted in favor of secession, just as Baldwin had said, heavily so. So Lincoln knew. He'd been told that those shots at Sumter could precipitate a war. And he also knew that the power to make war was against the Constitution. And so what he did was he wanted to have the South perceived as the aggressor by firing the first shot. So he sent unarmed ships, 3 unarmed ships with supplies, and to these guys at Sumter. Three ships.
Kind of to make it look like he was bringing in
helping out
the weapons.
And Baldwin's going, you know that the people of Charleston have been feeding them already, which they had. So it was all a ruse. And it was a feint. Even the New York Times at the time said it was a feint.
It was the side
object was, yes, exactly, to put upon the rebels the full and clear responsibility of commencing the war. And he'd even told his cabinet that if South Carolina's artillery opened fire, he could blame the Confederacy for starting a war. And so as the supply ships neared Sumter, Confederates said, you've got to surrender the fort. He refused, and then they began the shelling. And it was just what Lincoln wanted. Now he could, bloodshed was forced upon the national authority, as he put it. And even though no Union troops were killed in that bombardment, Davis ran into the trap. Jefferson Davis ran into the trap. And the South, it didn't want to conquer the North. Couldn't conquer the North. It didn't even try to. Every war took place in, I think the furthest north it went was South Pennsylvania. Most of the war was in Virginia and Tennessee. And it was defensive. It couldn't defeat the North. North had 22 million people. The South had 9 million. And Union soldiers outnumbered the Confederacy. The North had the factories. It had the manufacturing. All they could do was just keep it going for long enough to just drag it out and hope that the North lost interest. But Lincoln, the plan succeeded. They attacked Sumter. It fell and thus did more service than it otherwise could. Very dark quote. So, federal coffers, they were in bad shape. And by the way, all that gold discovered in the California gold rush went to the Union.
Interesting.
It helped fund their war effort. Without that gold in the California gold rush, they couldn't have paid for it.
Fascinating. Because I know the South. The South had printed. The South basically made all these different during the war, if I remember correctly. They had all these hyperinflating currencies constantly.
I'm sure of it. I've no doubt. I know about the Continental in the previous one, but I'm not so sure.
There's a lot of interesting, free money stories, and the South in this war had. I think they had to issue like 3 different currencies because they kept failing. In the North essentially couldn't. They couldn't deal with the. So to Lincoln's argument, to Steelman from his side, it's like the North really needed that revenue from the South. Like it couldn't really function without that revenue. The South didn't really need the North, right? Because the South could trade with the rest of the world, and they already were actively trading with the rest of the world. So the North just being cut out, like was just it was Lincoln probably felt like that was what's the term, existential, right? To lose that revenue.
It's exactly the case. The North needed the South. The South did not need the North. And
some things never change.
And the whole Union, Lincoln always said the reason for going to war was to preserve the Union. But the Union depended on Southern tariff revenue for its very existence. They know that the bulk of duties is paid by the Southern people, said the New Orleans Daily Crescent, and that by the iniquitous operation of the federal government, these duties are mainly expended among the Northern people. They know that. But anyway, with the Civil War to pay for, Lincoln introduced a swathe of new taxes. The US saw property taxes for the first time. Income tax made its very first appearance. Unconstitutional or not, it was introduced in 1861 on a temporary basis, of course, 3%.
That famous 3% number.
Yeah. And here's a good fact for you. It was 3% on incomes over $800. But as barely 3% of the population had an income of over $800, the tax found widespread support. Then the next year, the threshold came down to $600, so it wasn't quite as popular.
Get those billionaires.
Yeah. And to make sure those taxes were collected, Lincoln founded a new government body called the Internal Revenue Service. So you have him to thank for that as well.
Oh.
And in 1862, his Revenue Act introduced another law that has remained to this day, which is that American citizens living and working outside of America still have to pay tax in the US, unless they work for the government.
Oh.
The war was about more than lost tariff revenue. Succeeded states going into free trade with Europe was too big a threat to tolerate because northern businesses, manufacturing, shipping, and perhaps most influential of all, banking, would be cut out of the trade loop. That's why they didn't want it. And there was a great debate in the House of Commons, and a Liberal statesman in the UK, William Forster, said that slavery was the cause of the Civil War. And he was met with cries of, no, the tariff. Lincoln did not go to war to end slavery. That is bollocks. Do you know that expression? My paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union. He was saying that even as late as 1862. It is not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. It was about saving the Union. That was the whole thing. It wasn't about slaving.
He also said if I could not free any of them and save the Union, I would do it.
Absolutely.
If you could free them all, if you could free none of them, some of them, that's kind of what he was saying. So
yeah,
he would just take any option to win.
And then 1863, you got the Emancipation Proclamation. And by the way, slavery is like 60 years illegal in the UK at this point.
Yeah.
And 30 years the slave trade has been made illegal. And we've spent something like 40% of GDP policing the Atlantic, getting rid of it. But anyway,
who spent 40%?
We did, British.
Oh, you Brits.
We did more to end it than anyone. I know we were heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade in the first place, but
you guys are cleaning up your own mess.
Well, we did. And we didn't have slaves in the UK.
Yeah.
Anyway, 1863 Emancipation Proclamation Act. We had about played our, this is when Lincoln made slavery illegal. We had played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game. So he did it because he was trying to create upheaval within the southern states. So the southern states then had to go and deal with rebelling slaves rather than favoring.
Strategy.
It was a strategic thing.
It was kind of like importing millions of new voters, right?
Yeah.
That's
kind of similar.
Sounds very familiar.
1862, a load of Confederate diplomats go to England and say to the British authorities, we will abolish slavery. The Confederate States said this in 1862. We will abolish slavery if you give us diplomatic recognition. They said that before the Emancipation Act. We will abolish it. The South would have preferred to keep slavery, no doubt, but it was prepared to abolish it in order to get its independent status. That was the deal they tried to strike with the British in order to get recognition. You are never told that.
I think that's a good point to end this episode.
I'm quite finished.
Oh, okay. I guess we'll keep it going a little bit longer then.
And
Paul can clip
independence was more important to them, and the North wouldn't let them have it because it wanted the tax revenue. A free trading rival on its doorstep could not be countenanced. I'm not pretending that slavery wasn't an area of disagreement. It was. It was one of many. Tariffs, federal spending, border security, equal access to the new territories, sale of public land. These were all issues, but it was inequitable taxation that caused the division. Southern states wanted to keep more of what they had earned, and Lincoln and the northern states wanted their wealth for the Union. And in the popular understanding of how this story is told, the Confederates have been smeared, while the Union have been made out to be some great and noble cause. And at the end of the day, both sides were fighting to protect their economic interests.
It's never black and white.
It's never black and white.
There's always gray.
There's always grey, and sometimes you have to go, if the story's white, you have to go more black in order to get the grey area in the middle, the right colour, which is probably what I'm doing a little bit with this. But there was an article, Charles Dickens, 1861, published an article in his magazine, and it said, the quarrel between North and South is solely a fiscal quarrel. The last grievance of the South was the moral tariff, and it severed the last threads which bound the North and South together. No different to any other civil war or any other great revolt. Somewhere near its heart, there is always a tax story. Always. And it's usually overlooked.
I think that's where we should stop.